we're going to get into some regulatory and legislative issues that I think that I know will affect producers on farms, how we treat our pigs, what is available for us in the future. So I'll talk a little bit, get us all talking on the same page as far as terms and background, and then we'll look at what's going on in Congress on the national level this year. We'll look at what's going on with FDA as far as regulations. We'll look a little bit at what's going on with lawsuits that may affect availability of antibiotics and some timelines that we see for anticipated changes. So just background, U.S. Food and Drug Administration regulates both human and animal antibiotics as well as other animal health products except for vaccines. And their authority is granted to them under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So any changes, like when we had AMDUCA, which allowed extra label drug use by veterinarians, that actually was an amendment or a change in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. State pharmacy boards actually are the body that regulates veterinary prescribing. So if your veterinarian gets in trouble for prescribing something wrong, it's the state pharmacy board that has authority over that. But most state pharmacy boards really have very little interest, nor do they have the authority in regulating veterinary drugs in feed. So that's kind of where there's a little bit of a gray area. And we'll get into where that gray area falls and why that's important and as we go down our expected changes. As we look at how FDA label claims are, there are 4 uses for antibiotics. One is for disease treatment, then you have disease control, disease prevention, and then either growth promotion or improvement in nutritional efficiency. The first 3, disease treatment, control, and prevention, by FDA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, the World Health Organization, those are all considered therapeutic claims. Growth promotion or improvement of nutritional efficiency is sometimes called subtherapeutic. And then you have the advocates who are coming up with a term that they're calling non-therapeutic. And non-therapeutic, they try to say disease prevention and control because you are treating animals that are not overtly ill would be considered non-therapeutic. So that's one of the fights we have right now is going, what's therapeutic, what does non-therapeutic mean, and what is essential for maintaining animal health. We also have antibiotic classes that have been defined by FDA as medically important. And medically important would be those antibiotics that are in the same classes used in human medicine or that would select for resistance for drugs that are used in human medicine. Most antibiotics we use in swine production would be considered medically important. So if you look at tylosin, you look at tetracycline, you look at penicillin, the sulfonamides, those would all be considered medically important. The possible exceptions I see, we've listed up there, and those are possible because the drug sponsors would still have to probably defend those antibiotics, and that's bacitracin, carbidox, Narracin, the new tylosin, or the new, Elanco ionophore, flavomycin, and Denigard. Now we do know that Novartis, that is the sponsor for Denigard, has already voluntarily removed the growth promotion claim for that product. So just because those products are not considered medically important doesn't mean that the sponsors might not remove growth promotion claims for them. So antibiotics in feed must be used according to label direction. There is no extra label drug use allowed for animal feed antibiotics. The other thing we look at is because the state pharmacy boards don't regulate veterinary prescribing for animal feeds, FDA came up with a Veterinary Feed Directive, and we've got right now just a couple drugs that are fall under Veterinary Feed Directive. It's kind of like a prescription for feed, but it's under FDA oversight and not the state pharmacy boards. So currently, if you have a VFD as a producer, you're supposed to get an original copy to the feed mill. Can't be faxed, can't be transmitted electronically. It's written for the amount of feeds, the number of tons of feed that you expect to have consumed within a time period. And you're supposed to have a veterinarian client-patient relationship with the veterinarian that writes it. And you're supposed to keep records on that for 2 years at both the feed mill, the producer level, and the veterinarian. So right now it's written one group of pigs at a time for a certain amount of feed. Refills are a little difficult to actually get done. And so right now VFD is a pretty, has a lot of restrictions to it. So that's all the background. I'm hoping that as I run through, try and talk not too many acronyms, but that'll give you a little background in some of the changes that we're going to be seeing coming down the road. Legislatively, we've got a big year coming up in DC, and it should be easy, and it's not going to be. In 2013, the Animal Drug User Fee Act needs to be reauthorized. It's reauthorized every 5 years. And what a DUFA does is it provides that the animal health companies will pay user fees to FDA, and those user fees support FDA hiring reviewers to actually review the applications for whether it's label claim changes or new animal drug applications. The other thing a DUFA requires, and this happened in 2008 reauthorization, is it requires that FDA gather sales data from the animal health companies and report those. And also within the reporting of that sales data, if a drug has less than 3 sponsors making that drug, let's say you're the sole person, the sole company that makes a product, they're going to aggregate all of those less than 3 sponsored drugs together so that they don't give classified business information out. I mean, if you're selling $10 million of a drug and you're the only sponsor, you really don't want other drug companies knowing that figure of what you're selling. So a DUFA is renegotiated and reauthorized on a 5-year schedule. So it should be simple. The animal health companies sit down with FDA, they agree what their user fee schedule is going to be, and they go on from there and send it off to Congress. Because it is a piece of legislation that impacts FDA, it is seen as a Christmas tree that other germane legislation affecting FDA can be hung on. So we expect that we will see a lot of ornaments that people are going to try to hang on with the DUFA. Whoops, sorry, I've got going the wrong way. That's what I'm doing. So along with the DUFA, FDA recently issued what's called an ANPR, an Advance Notice to Proposed Rulemaking, to ask about other available data for antibiotic use data collection. So currently, as we mentioned, they require sales data on a calendar year basis. FDA has gotten a lot of challenges from some of the advocacy groups about the limited amount of data that they really have. When they have annual year sales data, they can just say, and I'm going to use tetracycline as an example, that we know that X number of pounds of tetracycline were sold. Because tetracycline is approved for use in cattle, sheep, pigs, turkeys, chickens, maybe even rabbits. They don't know what species of animal that tetracycline went into. They don't know if it went in at 10 grams or 400 grams per ton. They don't know if it's used for growth promotion, disease control, disease prevention, disease treatment. So that's the limited data that FDA has. They just know how much was sold in a year, but they don't know what the uses of it further than that were. So anyway, FDA did ask for comments on what other sources of data may be, with the idea that sales trends or use trends may give them some information about antibiotic resistance trends. That didn't seem to be enough for Representative Waxman, who is actually the ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee that will deal with FDA issues. Representative Waxman is from Los Angeles, and he is very active as an advocate on restricting antibiotic use. And his new issue is this data. We don't have enough data. And so he is proposing legislation called Delivering Antibiotics Transparency Act, or the Data Act. And this is this to me tells me he may have some bias going into it. This is a quote from his press release. It says, "The more we learn, the graver the threat becomes from overuse of antibiotics on industrial scale farms." So our view is that he is looking to collect data so that he can use it as a club with which to beat us with over the amount of antibiotics we use, not on how judiciously they're used or how carefully they're used or how appropriate that use is. They're looking for just more data to point fingers at the industry. The Data Act, because he tried in the 2008 ADUFA reauthorization to collect farm-level data and realized that that was a non-starter. In his proposed legislation, he's going to ask feed mills to report every batch of medicated feed that they would produce, the species of animals are going into, whether it was for growth promotion, treatment control, prevention, and the drug being used. And then somehow FDA is supposed to be able to receive all that data, make a model that says how much is going into each species, and report that. The other thing that we expect may be, we very much expect that Waxman will introduce the Data Act as introduce it as an amendment to move with ADUFA. So that's why I wanted to make sure you understood that the Data Act will never by itself move alone, but if he hooks it to ADUFA, it has a chance of moving through Congress. PAMTA, which you've all probably heard of before, Representative Louise Slaughter, who is the only microbiologist in Congress, introduces the PAMTA Act regularly every new Congress. I think this is probably the 4th or 5th, maybe even the 6th time PAMTA has been introduced. So on the House side, it's Louise Slaughter. On the Senate side, Dianne Feinstein has been kind of carrying the water on it. And PAMTA basically says we need to ban all routine uses of antibiotics that are also in classes that are medically important or used in human medicine. They would consider disease prevention and disease control to be a routine use. PAMTA has never gotten legs. It's a much tougher sell because it's very much taking authority away from FDA and legislating that authority for drug approvals. But we know that there will be a play as ADUFA moves through this year to also try to get some part of PAMTA attached to that act. Mrs. Slaughter gets a lot of press. She actually did a little survey last summer asking retailers, restaurants, and some of the packers and processors to tell her what % of their meat was produced antibiotic-free and what were the treatments used on the animals coming into their facilities. And I think what she's very much going to use that information to support Representative Waxman's Data Act is the fact that a lot of the people that she sent surveys to just basically said, we know that our producers that we buy animals from are following withdrawal times set by FDA, but they didn't have any other information on what antibiotic regimens those animals may have been following. So we really believe that this was all a coordinated effort for her to also be supporting the collection of more data. So timeline for ADUFA, it'll be, it's been sent to Congress. It will likely be introduced in February. The Senate says that they're going to start hearings on it in March. The House will start hearings in May. It needs to be passed on the floor by the end of July or FDA starts laying people off. And ADUFA expires, the 2008 expires in September, so it needs to be reauthorized no later than the end of September, and the goal of both houses is to have it move through by the end of July. So we'll be busy. Any of you can come visit us this year, and you may see some calls for action coming out for producers to be contacting their legislators to make sure that we get ADUFA, which is a very important animal health bill reauthorized, but have it reauthorized cleanly. So this gets to regulatory activities. So FDA, which really has the authority to regulate antibiotics, has issued some new rules. And this came out in April. And what they did is FDA published 3 regulations, new regulations. One was what's called a final draft, or final guidance 209, a draft guidance 213, and a advance notice of proposed rulemaking on how they would change VFD language. And we'll walk through what each one of those means. First of all, if you looked at a lot of the public or lay press, when they talked about FDA issuing guidance, they'd say, well, FDA has voluntary guidelines. Guidance is how the FDA intends to do business. And unless they are challenged in a court of law, their guidances hold the weight of regulation or weight of law. And I would say voluntary is relative. I always use the analogy that my mom used to tell me my curfew was voluntary, but there were definitely consequences if I missed my curfew. There will be consequences for drug companies who do not voluntarily comply with Guidance 209 and 213. What Guidance 209 did, it just laid out a new philosophy for FDA. FDA says growth promotion uses, or what they're now calling production uses, of antibiotics that are medically important is injudicious. And whoever wrote this was a regulatory genius. And regulatory genius may be an oxymoron as well, but there's no regulatory definition for injudicious. If FDA had said using growth promotants are unsafe, they by law have to take action under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to withdraw those antibiotics. But they can say injudicious, it just sounds like it's a bad thing, but they don't have any mandatory need to then go do anything about it. So that's a huge, huge deal, because if it was unsafe, we'd be in a court, the drug companies would be in court for the next 2 decades figuring this out. It also requires that any animal health uses, which they did say was disease prevention, control, and treatment, any uses that are essential to protect animal health need to be under veterinary oversight, but they didn't really define veterinary oversight. So that's all Guidance 209 did. It set up their philosophy of what they want to do going forward. Guidance 213 came out, and it's really the roadmap on how they're going to implement 209. And so they said they're going to voluntarily work with the sponsors, the animal health sponsors, to discontinue production claims. So they're going to remove growth promotion, improvement in nutritional efficiency claims. They're going to migrate any over-the-counter labels to either a VFD for the feed-grade antibiotics or a prescription status for those that are water, and now they're talking injectable over-the-counter drugs as well, would be going to prescription status. And they also set out for the drug companies what the data requirements would be if they had a drug that was used as a growth promotant, but they felt it was actually preventing a specific disease. So if the drug companies had that data, they could come in, show it to FDA, and ask for a disease prevention claim at that same dose. We have no idea how many companies may have that data or may take advantage of trying to get a disease prevention, control, or treatment claim at those production levels or doses. So they set out some timelines. They said within 3 months of when Guidance 213 becomes final, the animal health sponsors have to come in, meet with FDA, and tell them their intentions. Are they going to give up their labels? Are they going to do more research? What are the intentions of the drug companies? And then any changes had to be implemented within 3 years. And if they don't voluntarily do this, this is where my mom and her curfew consequences come in. If they don't voluntarily give up these claims, make these changes, then FDA clearly stated that they will take action under the authorities given to them by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So the threat was very clearly stated that if you don't do this, if you don't play the game nicely, we will take action. So what do we really say that it means for producers and veterinarians? Within 3 to 4 years, I think virtually, except for those drugs we listed as exceptions, all growth promotion or improvement of nutritional efficiency claims will go away. We're very unsure. I don't have a good feel from my grapevine of animal health companies how many companies are actually going to invest money to migrate or to ask for a disease prevention or control claim on those growth promotion doses. Most of these drugs are old. I mean, most of them are from 1960s and before. So investing a lot of money on a drug that's going to be generic or is a generic drug is something that sponsors are going to think really hard about whether it makes business sense to try to do that additional research. We do know that the feed-grade antibiotics that are in those medically important classes will become Veterinary Feed Directive products. And we've got very clear signal that all water meds that are in those classes would become prescription. And now we're starting to hear rumblings that also over-the-counter injectables such as, let's just name a common one, Pen-G, that you can buy at the feed store, very much likely would become a prescription-only product. The reason we see them moving to Veterinary Feed Directive is that, as we stated, the state pharmacy boards don't want to regulate feed, and so Veterinary Feed Directive was the only way that FDA had to demonstrate that veterinarians were involved in the decision on what drugs to use or what antibiotics should be included in feed. We went in and tried to talk to them about, what about just demonstrating a veterinary client-patient relationship? You couldn't order feed till you had some form that said I have a VCPR. There was no movement. They really felt that VFD was their only opportunity to demonstrate veterinary oversight. But what they did do is that they're trying to make it a little more user-friendly, and it was very interesting because we held several meetings with FDA, with the other commodity groups, as well as the bovine veterinarians, the swine veterinarians, the avian pathologists in the room, to say what is workable. What we've asked for isn't exactly what we got. What we asked for was a dose duration and an expiration date and then FDA wanted some sort of bounds around it. So we said, how about dose duration, expiration date for a premises? So that your bound is that if you've got a 2,000 head finisher, you're not going to be able to treat more than 2,000 head at a time because that's your bound. You've got a barn size that's going to limit the number of animals. What they've put out in their advance notice of proposed rulemaking is that they'd do it for 6 months for a production site or a premises, dose duration and a number of refills. So instead of just having an expiration date, you'd actually, if you're the veterinarian, have to say, I also authorize only a certain number of refills during that 6-month period. They also want listed an approximate number of animals to be treated. Now that's we're a little fuzzy. We don't know if you're writing for that 2,000 head finisher, is the approximate number of animals to be treated 2,000? Is it 2,000 times the 3 refills or 4 refills that I've issued? Is it 2,000? And maybe a nursery would have been a better example. If I'm going to turn that nursery 2 or 3 times in that 6 months period, is it 2,000 times the number of times I turn that facility? So we're trying to straighten that out, trying to really understand what they mean. And then because VFDs are going to not be reportable, who cares? I mean, it's who's going to collect that data, who's going to police that data? Are the feed mills going to have to try to say, whoa, I mixed more feed than I think those 2,000 animals would eat? So there's a lot of uncertainty involved in that. They will allow fax, email of VFD forms. They're not going to require the originals to go to the feed mill, and records need to be maintained for 12 months. The other thing that they're very uncertain about, and it's going to be an an issue is floor stock medicated feed. So let's say you're a 4-H kid, you're buying medicated feed at Fleet Farm. First of all, how do you get it? How do you get your VFD form? Will those sorts of retail outlets want to mess with receiving VFDs and the record keeping involved around it? There's just a lot of uncertainty. I think this will very much disproportionately affect small producers, and especially the kids with 4-H pigs or FFA kids, show pigs that have really small groups of animals. So we've also got, FDA's got some legal challenges going on, and this could affect what's going on for pork producers. The National Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, is working with other members of the Keep Antibiotics Working Coalition, and they brought a lawsuit in, I believe it's the 2nd District of New York, but I know it's New York, I'm not sure which district it is. And they brought suit against FDA because FDA had opened what they call a notice of opportunity of hearing on growth promotion uses of penicillin and tetracycline in 1977. So FDA held those hearing opportunities for hearing open for a long time, in some ways to be able to keep it almost as a threat. If we don't do more research, if you don't give us more data, if we don't do judicious use, we've still got these notices of opportunity open, and we can go to court, we can go to try to withdraw those labels. If they go to a hearing, it's kind of an interesting setup. The drug companies come bring data trying to prove that their drugs are safe as labeled, and they go to an administrative court judge who actually works for FDA and present their case. So in some ways it's kind of an uphill battle, because you're arguing your case in front of somebody who is paid by the people who are saying your drug is unsafe. So it's a very difficult process, and it's not often successful. In fact, we don't know, we've gone back and tried to figure out if there's ever been a hearing held in which the drug sponsor actually won. So it's a real threat to the ability to keep your labels if you go for a notice of opportunity of hearing. One of the reasons we think also that FDA never went and held those hearings is they didn't probably have the weight of evidence to be able to defend their claims that these uses may be unsafe. The other thing that NRDC had done is they had filed what are called citizen petitions with FDA, asking FDA to withdraw those label claims for all subtherapeutic uses of all antibiotics. And FDA had not responded to those citizen petitions in a timely manner. So what happened? FDA lost. FDA lost pretty big time. The judge was much more interested in the science than the legal opinion of whether FDA had to hold those hearings. So he got very involved in the threat of antibiotic resistance, and that FDA was not protecting human health. So he very much took an advocacy position, and we really believe that NRDC very, very carefully picked what court they were going to file this suit in, so that they would get a judge that had looked at it as an advocacy position. So what happened is that FDA went back and said, we're going to deny the citizen petitions, and we're going to close those notice of opportunities of hearing. Judge Katz didn't really like that, and he directed the FDA to evaluate the safety risks of the petition drugs and either make a finding that the drugs are not shown to be safe or provide an explanation as to why the agency is refusing to make such a finding. And so he's ordered FDA to go back and again review the drugs, all drugs that were in that citizen's petition. There was a lot of press about it, and basically a subsequent court order, FDA had asked for, FDA's appealed these findings, or rulings and asked that they don't need to take action until the appeal is heard. And that was denied, and the judge said, no, you need to go forward with these hearings. So what they've agreed with is that the hearings need to be held and completed within approximately 5 years. Well, that's about the same timeline we're expecting for Guidance 213 to be finalized. So if the drug sponsors voluntarily give up those label claims, there would be nobody to go to a hearing, and there'd be no reason to hold such a hearing. So the timelines are all still kind of coming down. Next 3 to 4 to 5 years, we can expect significant changes in our availability of certain uses of antibiotics. So next steps, this is a VFD next step. The USDA and the American Veterinary Medical Association are working with FDA to understand implementation of what would it mean for farmers, especially those in remote areas and small farmers, to move everything to VFD or RX. And I think the closest listening session that will be held is out in Pierce, South Dakota, but we will also probably be sending out, for those of you who get the NPPC Leader publications and others, sending out information about those listening sessions and looking at making sure we have pork producers at some of those sessions. We know that the sponsor companies are evaluating their options, but bottom line, in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we will likely see major changes occurring.